think, look, we have a strong relationship. We need to manage it. That doesn't mean we have to buy his nationalist, ultra-nationalist narrative, which is putting him, I think, not only in a difficult situation for Russia and Russian people, but it also looks like it's not going to succeed.
As you know, this week's Raja Mandala, your column is, of course, on the Ukraine crisis, but more specifically on Germany and France, but Germany in particular in Europe's reaction, which has been, in fact, in some cases, stronger than certainly Russia may have anticipated. Everyone should read the column. The full column will, of course, be on the indianexpress.com. And wherever you're watching this video, it should be there in the description. So one of the most interesting things I found in this Times column is that you make a distinction between the Soviet Russia, the USSR, Russia as a successor state, and now Putin's Russia. Whereas we seem to be thinking in some ways in India and beyond is of Russia as going back to the Soviet era even, but this seems more as though it's in the Tsarist kind of mode, an imperial mode. You know, why those differences are important and how that should, what does that mean for India, even in terms of nostalgia for our relationship with Russia, to see the current aggression by Putin?
In many ways, the origins of the Indian nationalism, some historians dated back to 1919, the interwar period when India came into its own as the First World War woke up India to the developments outside. That was also the period when the Bolshevik Revolution took place. The Russian state became the Soviet state, and since then, Russia has been a very, very important partner for India. Whether it was in the sense, the phase of anti-Western imperial struggles, and then independent India, you had the one section, Russian support for India's heavy industry. You had the progressives, the communists, the left, and all kinds of leftists, not just the communists, saw Russia as a beacon of hope for changing the world. So that was the idea in which the interwar period animated. And after independence, of course, the communists got divided eventually on Russia. But the Indian state, the Indian establishment, for the foreign policy side, for the diplomats, Russia became critical for the veto in the UN Security Council because US and Britain was supporting Pakistan. So we needed Russia to veto. And then after 61, 62, there was expanding defense cooperation. So much of our military got used to the defense equipments being bought from Russia. And then the larger question of regional balance of power, where the Sino-Soviet split coincided with the India-China split. So we saw the regional balance of power, Soviet Union being an important player. So we assumed that Putin was just simply a successor for this regime. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, India had real difficulty with Yeltsin's Russia. So when Putin came and restored Russia, I think there were people clapping for it, most for the Indians, because for them, Yeltsin was looking to the West and Putin seemed to give it a much more broad-based policy. But I don't think we fully read what he was trying to do. In fact, even in the last 3 months, I think all of us assumed there is a deal to be done. He was raising the stakes to negotiate and cut a deal. But many of his recent speeches, I think he didn't hide his intention that he wanted to put the whole Russia back. And he was very critical of Lenin for putting the autonomy of the Soviet republics. And he says, look, you must go back to a Russia that is wide. And for him, Belarus, which is often called white Russians, and Ukrainians who are often called small little Russians. So bringing them back in, I think he sees that as probably as his legacy and duty. But this day and age, you can't tell another country, you have no right to exist, and I'll simply walk in. And that's where I think he probably miscalculated on the Ukrainian reaction. He miscalculated on the international reaction. So for us, I think, look, we have a strong relationship. We need to manage it. That doesn't mean we have to buy his nationalist, ultra-nationalist narrative, which is putting him, I think, not only in a difficult situation for Russia and Russian people, but it also looks like it's not going to succeed. So both ways, both as a idea as well as its likely success, I think we should keep our fingers crossed rather than put ourselves in a position where we're seen as defending Putin.
Right, exactly. So, then the other the big thing in your column is Germany. I mean, there's of course France and Germany both, but in the EU, Germany has now for a while been the de facto leader of the EU, at least from the outside. That's what it looks like. It is the largest economy, has a huge manufacturing base, which is important. On tech, things like that, where you think China may overtake the US someday, Germany still got its own industry, is very much ahead of Europe. And now with the Chancellor talking about armament again as one of the platforms for Europe to come back. Of course, and it's been 2-3 generations since the Second World War now. Do you think that changes the picture of Europe in a very big way? Because it also, if Germany takes this kind of role, it also means perhaps not the kind of dependence on the US you've seen in the last few decades.
Yeah, I think the German, what Chancellor Scholz did over the weekend, it's quite dramatic in many ways. One, on the defense side, the Germans were very reluctant to accept the push by the Americans. Look, increase your defense spending, become 2%. You must take more responsibility for the defense of Europe. But for Germany, there is a soft corner for Russia that they feel it's nothing to do with the US. It's about the Second World War, and that Germany inflicted so much of suffering on Russia. So the German elite feels that, look, it is their moral responsibility to avoid war with Russia at all costs. So they feel deeply, guilty about what happened in the Second World War, vis-a-vis Russia in particular. Of course, there were other countries, even Ukraine suffered a lot. But with Russia, the sense of guilt on the Second World War is very strong. Second, in the Social Democratic Party, which is currently headed by Scholz, is a Social Democrats. If you go back to the 70s, Willy Brandt, who was the chancellor then, at the height of the Cold War, he sought to reach out to East Germany, to Russia. Essentially, Social Democrats, of course, date back to the communist parties and their tradition of saying, look, we should have peace. I mean, that peace is more important than the ideological contestation with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So there's been a long tradition that, look, some kind of a reconciliation must be found in Central Europe. So that tradition lingers on. And that's why the SPD in particular is deeply opposed to any deep confrontation with Russia. And the third, the moral dilemmas, of course, coincide with the economic opportunities. I mean, you could say, look, Germany and Russia are perfectly complementary economies. That German industry needs Russian resources, and Germany also needs Russian gas. So what you have is actually a trade between Germany and Russia in 2021 was close to $66 billion, which is here as a NATO member. We're not talking about, some China trade. China is about 120 billion, 160 billion, I believe, last year. And India's trade is only 10 billion. So the nature of interdependence, often we say, look, we are stuck with Russia kind of thing, but the German interdependence with Russia is deep. And coupled with the political moral issues to economic interdependence. So Germans were very reluctant to push the Russians on the Ukraine issue. And they were not willing to scrap the Nord Stream, that is, they're totally dependent on gas from Germany. In the last 1 week, first, Germans had to drop the Nord Stream the moment the invasion took place. And in the speech, he said a number of things. One, they must give full support to Ukraine. Until last week, Germany was not willing to give any weapons to Ukraine, saying that, look, they can't send arms to zones of conflict. That's again a legacy from Second World War. Then he says, look, we have to defend ourselves, so we must punish Russia. And the third, it's not separating from the US, but strengthening NATO. So that is the collective security institution. And the fourth, rebuild German armed forces. He's already announced a $100 billion fund for this year. And after that, from next year, it will be $2 billion a year. So Germany is going to be, if they do it actually, they'll be a big military player. And after that, are saying that, look, need to reduce the dependence on Russia, on the gas, on the energy. So he's given a whole lot of program on, find ways of renewable sources so that you're not tied to Russia. So I think this is a sweeping agenda. A Germany that was hesitant, widely criticized for being too soft on Moscow, is today standing up. And this, I think, for Russia, Putin saw Germany as a natural partner. In fact, in a speech to the Bundestag in 2001, he talks about the connections between the German elite and the Russian elite, about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. Then there is the music, Tchaikovsky and Beethoven. So the Central Europe, the links were deep. But I think Putin seems to have fundamentally miscalculated this sense of probably believing your own propaganda that the West is divided, the West has problems, therefore in a crisis you can separate them. But actually, all crises have tended to unite the West, and I think that's it. So that's a huge challenge now for. So what has Putin achieved? He's made Ukraine into actually a nation by trying to say you are not a nation. They're going to be forced into a nation because of the fights they're doing. Second, he's united Europe. He's strengthened NATO. And he's put himself at odds, which is going to cause enormous economic hardship for the Russian people. And I think that is the tragedy at this point that is unfolding.
Right, sir. Thank you. So actually, one last question. So what you're saying about Germany, and then you said about India, we seem to be in similar dilemmas. Of course, ours is complicated by the fact that it's defense spent. We're dependent on Russia for defense. So right now, do you think Delhi so far on the UN, we've been broadly non-committal and quiet? Do you think that is the way to go, given that now the talks going on in Belarus? I think as we're recording this, there's some talks going on in Belarus about, depending on how that goes, if there is a ceasefire, that this is the way to do it, stand with Ukrainian people on humanitarian grounds, but not really condemn Russia for the time being?
Look, I think the initial reaction was one of, where India's abstention has been widely criticized. But the fact is, India's in the last, vote in the UN Security Council, where it said, look, it solidly supports the territorial integrity. Yeah. Because India, like China, cannot support a situation where one country comes and takes another piece of territory and say, look, this is mine. Yeah. Because given our own problems in Kashmir and a whole lot of other insurgencies, China has a similar kind of position. So finally, we came out in emphasizing the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity. The second, I think, that it was that not being one-sided, we started supporting diplomacy, which is what President Putin's call to Prime Minister Modi, where Modi talked about diplomacy, dialogue. To that extent, at least India was making some contribution. And now today, India has announced sending of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine at this point of time. So I think we've eventually, coming to a right place. Yeah. In terms of recognizing that, look, India's, a relationship that it simply can't stand up and say, look, denounce Russia and that. But at the same time, I think he's making it clear to the Russians, look, what you're doing is not right. Yeah. Which I think is slowly, and then Prime Minister Modi also took a call from the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Normally, he wouldn't have taken that call. So I think that we have modulated our position. But what the point I was trying to make in the column, that look, those people who criticize India for its abstention, as if India should just simply, stand up and attack Russia, don't understand the deep cultural links that, and more culturally, is political, economic, that emerged between India and Russia, that generations of Indians have grown, seeing Russia as a natural partner. Since then, today, Russia trade is only 10 billion. We do $160 billion of trade with the US. But I think the political class in India feels there is Russia stood by us. Because today, Indian economy is bigger than Russia's. India is $3.1 billion. Russia is at 1.6. So we're not small, weak, looking for Russian support. But the sense of, you want to call it gratitude, obligation, a sense of an old friend, don't want to abandon an old friend. Yeah. So that is deep. But I think the political class also, time has come for it to see that what Putin is doing is bad for Russia. Yeah. Those of us who see Russia as a great civilization, as a country with a deep history, that we should separate, not see Putin as Russia and Russia as Putin. And that our warmth to Russia must be kept, Russian people must be kept intact, while pointing to Putin that, look, what he's doing is bad and that it's good for him and for the world and for Russia if he does negotiate a settlement and finds a way to walk back from the dangerous situation he's caught himself in.
Great, sir. Thanks so much. We hope that we should have an update on the talks soon. Hopefully, violence stops and talks move forward. Everyone, the column is on indianexpress.com, and we will see you next week.